Lee and Blake Lovell here from Southeastern14.com. We are continuing our previews of the SEC football schedules for 2022. I believe this is number 5, Blake. And today we get to the Missouri Tigers.
Yeah, I'd like to say there's a lot to, I don't say if exciting is the word, but this is probably one of those schedules that isn't exactly the same as some of the others we've talked about. And, I think some of that has to do with expectations for Missouri and, probably not expected to be an SEC's title contender or anything like that on paper. But I think when you compare this schedule to a lot of the others, I'm not going to say it's an easy schedule because it's not, because you still got all the SEC games. You look at the teams they'll play in the West. I think they got some interesting couple matchups there, but I think overall this is just kind of one of those schedules that probably in the middle to the bottom tier in terms of overall strength. Which again, I think being in the East also plays into that a little bit. But yeah, I think overall not the most meat on the bone for this schedule probably.
I think the word I would use for is appropriately scheduled, because Missouri, as I look through the computer rankings, is checking in around 55 nationally for most of the ones that I have seen so far. There's several more to come. Missouri was 6-7 a year ago, lost its bowl game. And, you've got to play some pretty good teams in the East already. You've got Tennessee and Kentucky and, of course, Georgia. You know, what they've done is it's kind of similar to Kentucky. They've scheduled some built-in wins with SEMO. Louisiana Tech and New Mexico State are probably among the 20 worst teams in the FBS, if not maybe the 10 worst teams this year. New Mexico State would certainly fit in that, and probably one of the 5 worst. But 7 home games, which always helps. And so let's dive right into it. Louisiana Tech in week 1. This was a team that a year ago gave Mississippi State a run for its money. If I recall correctly, State had to hit a field goal in the final seconds of that game. Tech not as good as it's been in the past. It is 100 plus in almost all the computer polls, checking in around 113 based on the average of what I've got. Kansas State, though, Blake, in week 2, that'll be one of the more interesting non-conference games, I think, this season in the SEC, as Missouri renews an old rivalry dating back to its Big 12 days.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting one. I think, yeah, like you said, I think the appeal is just playing a former Big 12 foe. Don't know exactly the expectations, maybe what Kansas State will have. And I mean, it's like we said, these early season games, especially these non-conference games like this, are always hard to kind of predict early on in the season when you have teams that, are of this level of an SEC, of a Big 12, and you kind of have those matchups. There's always going to be some things that, will stand out. But I think, again, these first 3 games, specifically Louisiana Tech, Kansas State, Appling, Christian, I just think I don't know how much we learned about Missouri from these first 3 games. Obviously, I think we learned the most based on how things play out at Kansas State, but I really don't know exactly how much we learned maybe from those 3 games in particular.
Yeah, Kansas State is probably a top 35 team in terms of where the computers are putting them. So that's a very competitive game. That might be fair to say that's maybe sort of a barometer game for Missouri. That's
Yeah.
unfair, because you do see teams change a good bit between September and November, for better or for worse. But I think that should give us maybe a good idea of where they stand, at least in terms of talent.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair to say. Certainly of the first 3 games, I think that's the one that you'll circle. And, if they go in and win that game, then I think your opinion changes a little bit, because again, at that point, you would assume if they win that game, they'll be 3-0 heading into the Auburn game on September 24th. So I think definitely that's a huge boost if you can win that one. But again, I don't know, and maybe that is one that I'm not giving enough credit to maybe what that would mean, but it would be a significant win. And like I said, I just think I don't know exactly how much we learn about Missouri until probably September 24th.
The next one up is Abilene Christian, which of course is an FCS school. Looking at some rankings online, Abilene doesn't show up in any of those. You're always kind of looking for that upset special of a team maybe that's preseason ranked. That's not the case in the limited research I've done on the Wildcats. So from there, you move on to, boy, this is a brutal stretch of the schedule here from games 5 to 7 at Auburn, Georgia, at Florida. Um, Going to be tough to win any of those. I think Auburn and Florida would be more interesting matchups in Missouri, although Missouri beat them a year ago under very different circumstances. You might like to get Auburn a little bit earlier, or really, you might get to Auburn a little later, is what you'd prefer. Maybe get Florida a little bit earlier as it's having time to gel with a new coaching staff. But what do you make of those three right there?
Yeah, we did Auburn's schedule. We talked about kind of the interesting start for them. So again, I think it's always you factor in everyone else's schedule too, and that is one we've done. We talked about kind of the interesting start for Auburn's schedule, and obviously Missouri's going to be part of that. What was it? I think the first 5 games or so, we were really talking about the lots of ways that could go for Auburn. So yeah, I mean, obviously that's a challenge. And like I said, not knocking the SEC East. I think it's just when you compare seemingly how the schedules break down, I think the East is a little bit more able to navigate that than if you were in the West right now. And I think that's just because I think if you stack them from top to bottom, I'm
Yeah.
still probably, I'm probably still going to favor the West over the East. But I think as we've said though, there's the potential for teams like South Carolina to be surprising. We talk about, I think there are high expectations for both Tennessee and Kentucky. We know Tennessee will be on the schedule a little bit later here in a second, but yeah, so I think it's, going on the road to Auburn, Florida, South Carolina. I think probably, Missouri they'll be an underdog in every one of those games, would be my guess. The South Carolina one, maybe not, but like we said, I think South Carolina is very, an interesting team. And by that point, you don't really know. And obviously, I think Missouri will be favored at home against Vanderbilt. Georgia is Georgia. We understand that, but it's a pretty big stretch here of games that I think that you'll look at these and you'll be the underdog probably in at least 3 of these. Like I said, I think the South Carolina one could go either way in terms of this 5 game stretch here, but yeah, it's manageable. Again, I'm not saying it's not difficult, but I think it's when you really look at it overall, I think it's these road games, which we always talk about, are the ones that it's hard to get a great feel for because I think naturally we're just going to give the edge to the home team in a lot of these games, at least looking at it on paper going into the season.
Well, next comes a bye, and then what I would say is the make or break portion of the Tiger season. That October the 22nd, Vanderbilt for homecoming, then a road trip to South Carolina in what should be a pretty competitive game, and then Kentucky in a game where Kentucky should be favored, but this one is in Columbia, Blake. I think that Missouri needs to win two of these three here to feel really, really good about its season. You look at the Vandy game, you call that an easy win, but that game was in Nashville a year ago. It was anybody's ball game with 3 minutes left. Missouri walked out with a road win. Missouri did beat South Carolina a year ago, right before the Gamecocks got hot to close the season. And then the Kentucky game, that was an early game last year. I remember that as one of those, we really don't know which team is better. This will settle it. That was a pretty decisive check mark in Kentucky's favorite at the end of the season, but a closer game. I think this is really, again, where Missouri's season is made or broken.
Yeah, I mean, Missouri's goal is to find enough wins to make a bowl, right? Like I think that's the goal. I don't think it's to get to the SEC championship game this season. We know everyone's goal is that, but I think realistically, it's how do you find enough wins to get to a bowl game? And I think this is that stretch where, like you said, I think Vanderbilt has to be a win. I think if you can steal one of the two, Kentucky and South Carolina, I think that would be significant. Like we said, because we go back and we say there's a chance you start 3-0. Winning games at Auburn and Florida will be tough. Beating Georgia at home is going to be a challenge. But this is really that stretch. And as of right now, I don't think they're winning at Tennessee. I've said I think Tennessee is the team that I would circle as one that could really make a huge jump this year. So I think that'll be a challenge. So yeah, those 3 games, and I think you said it. I mean, it's Vanderbilt, South Carolina, Kentucky. Those are 3 big games. They are every year, but I think with how this schedule plays out, I think you circle those 3 and say, boy, if again, I think coming out of that 2-1, if you go 3-0, then my goodness, like you're feeling great about things. Think if you go 3-0 in that stretch, but I think you got to go at least 2-1 which I think they can do just based on how that plays out. So
Yeah, the Tennessee game last year was over in the first quarter. Literally, it just Tennessee jumped all over Missouri and never took its foot off. Well, did take its foot off the gas a little bit, but the points had piled up by that point. New Mexico State, in the computer polls I'm tracking, supposed to be one of the worst two teams in the FBS. And then closing at Arkansas, sort of a geographic rivalry. Those teams played last year. Arkansas won by 17. This one is going to be in Missouri. That helps a little bit, but Arkansas should be, and Tennessee both should be pretty decisive favorites in those games.
yeah, when you think about the home game tiers, what I would look at on this entire schedule, they play Louisiana Tech at home, Abilene Christian at home, Georgia at home. I think you chalk that one up as a loss. Um, but then you play Vanderbilt at home, you play Kentucky at home, New Mexico State and Arkansas. I think all those games except for the Georgia one are at least, again, I'm not saying Missouri's going to be favored in all of them because they're not, but I think they're at least games that you look at and say, all right, like these are big swing games. Some of those, right? Like Arkansas
Mhm.
and Kentucky, like those are two big ones when you look at that. And like I said, I just think right now they're better than Vanderbilt, so I think I would give Missouri the nod over Vanderbilt on that one. But like you said, it was a close game last year. But I think those are the kind of games that if you're going to elevate yourself in the East, I think beating a Kentucky, obviously beating an Arkansas to finish the season would give you some momentum. Those are the home games. But then I think, like we said, I think there are ones that look. I mean, we've talked about it. Auburn, Florida. It's hard to know exactly what to expect from those two teams.
Mhm.
I think at least most people expect them to be better than Missouri overall, but we still don't know exactly what to expect. I mean, then there's the intrigue, like we said, of a team like South Carolina. So actually, the more I look at the schedule, it is more intriguing maybe than I initially gave it credit for. But I still think it's one, and you said it best. I think it's sort of adequately put together where
Mhm.
it doesn't feel like it's just impossible, right? Like and it doesn't feel like there's just all these different like man, you just don't get any let up. I think there's actually it sets up pretty nicely in terms of how the entire schedule sort of balances out.
Yeah, Missouri has won either 5 or 6 games each of the last 3 seasons. It seems like this schedule perhaps sets them up to do that again. You've got probably 3 built-in wins with with Abilene Christian. SEMO was a year ago, with New Mexico State and Louisiana Tech. You've got a game with Vanderbilt, which it should win. So let's give them 4 at that point. And then, who knows? Florida, Auburn, we talked about that. We talked about South Carolina being a game that was close that Missouri won a year ago. So this sort of feels like a schedule that sets up Missouri to sort of return to that level where it has settled in lately.
Yep, and we'll do our predictions for this heading into the season. We'll go through game by game, but I do think going back to what I said, I think just getting to that bowl game, finding those number of wins, I think they can do that with this schedule. And like I mentioned, I think there are several swing games here that you look at and could go several different ways. But it doesn't feel overall, it doesn't feel as daunting as maybe some of the other schedules that we've looked at. And I think when we looked at the numbers with like Fuel Steel and places like that, I think Missouri's schedule in terms of overall strength, it's not easy by any means. I think it's still like a top 40 schedule, which if you're in the SEC, you would expect. But I think it's still probably near the bottom in terms of comparing it to, like I said, I think a lot of those SEC West teams, just by nature of who they're going up against in all those divisional games, I think those schedules just tend to be tougher when you're looking at just the data on those. So
Yeah, it's 37th in Phil Steele to be exact, and I believe in looking at this, Georgia's is easier.
that's the
That
only one I think,
that's
isn't
the
it?
only
Yeah.
one I believe that's below Missouri, and of course
Yeah.
Georgia doesn't have to play itself, which helps. But yes, that's the
Yeah.
way it shakes out. So anyway, thank you for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. Again, we've either previewed your favorite SEC team schedule, or we're going to do that. So stay tuned. If you haven't seen your team yet, it's coming up really soon.